Welcome everyone. Final video is here. Nigeria. Let's get right to it. Okay, Nigeria was a British colony for approximately 100 years. Received its independence in 1960. That legacy of colonialism has had both a positive and a negative impact on Nigeria. But its modern history has been marked by several military dictatorships and military coups. Fortunately, that has not happened recently, but there have been several throughout the time period. As soon as Nigeria became independent, it followed a parliamentary system of government, which is not surprising since that is the system of Great Britain as well. But in 1979, it switched to a presidential system that looks a lot more like the United States. The greatest problem in Nigeria is ethnic conflict. Colonialism led a legacy of ethnic and religious division. So the north is dominated by Muslims and the south is dominated by Christians, and they have struggled tremendously to unite. Okay, so what is this system of government? Well, it is a federalist system on paper, but in reality, the executive branch exerts enormous powers, not only over lawmaking, but basically running the entire country. But the current president is Muhammadu Buhari. He was elected in 2015. They have the same system as the US. You're allowed to run for a 4-year term and you can run for 2 terms. He was just recently reelected in February and will finish out that second term, we assume. The way they run their elections is really unlike anything I've seen before. There are 36 states in Nigeria. In order to win, you have to get 25% of the vote in 2/3 of those states. This is their effort to try to promote unity. If that doesn't happen, then there is a runoff election. And the president is the commander in chief of the armed forces. Now, as far as their legislature, same as the US. They just call it the National Assembly, but the divisions are the Senate and the House of Representatives. All of them serve 4-year terms. The Senate has 109 members. There are 36 states in Nigeria. Each state receives 3 senators, and then they add one for the capital city of Abuja. All of those elections are direct elections. The House of Representatives has 360 members, and they're, again, all single member districts. So Nigeria uses first past the post, just like the American system. And then the Supreme Court was created recently in 1999. Again, in theory, it has the power of judicial review, but rarely is it enforced. The number of justices does fluctuate. They have 16 right now, but they're allowed to have up to 21. They have to have 15 years of experience, and they must retire at 70. Okay. Political parties and democracy in Nigeria. The parties change rather frequently, so I would not focus too much on that. If you're interested, Buhari is a member of what's called the All Progressive Congress. The previous president was Goodluck Jonathan. He was part of the People's Democratic Party, but it's not as simple. It's really more about ethnic loyalties and regional differences. Nigeria has democratized its political process. They've gotten rid of this military rule that I referred to. Nigeria does have a free press, so please keep that in mind. That contributes greatly to democracy. They've tried to redraw state boundaries to have better representation, and they do have an independent National Electoral Commission. But still has a poor record on human rights. One example, in 1995, an environmental activist, Ken Saro-Wiwa, and 8 others were detained and they were executed for their activity. Sharia law still exists in the northern states where the Muslims dominate. And like I said, Nigeria does have a federalist system, but the local powers are not anywhere near as strong as they have on the central level. They do try to give each group representation, though, in the cabinet. So they are making efforts. As far as voting, there are many barriers to voting in Nigeria. They've had election day problems. Some of the polling places are extremely remote, and there's been a history of voter fraud. Nigerians are a little bit nervous about speaking up against this for fear of being retaliated against. There's been violence at the polls, and not just in voting, but they have oil pipelines that have been blown up, and they've even kidnapped engineers. All right, 3 major ethnic groups in Nigeria are the Hausa Fulani, which is predominantly in the north, The Igbo, which is more in the south and southeastern part, they tried to actually break away in a place called Biafra. And the Yoruba are in mostly the western part. But it's, I think, more important just to know north-south divide. All right, the one major resource of Nigeria is oil. Nigeria is a rentier state and tremendous wealth as a result of its oil production. The Niger Delta region is a source of controversy because of this, because all sides would like to have access to this, and it's led to tremendous corruption on all levels. Large scale oil production has generated tremendous revenue, obviously, on the global stage. A lot of foreign investment as well in Nigeria. But it's dangerous because if they only rely on oil, they should be concerned about whether or not fluctuations in the market are going to lead to even further economic problems in the country. It's a joint venture between the government and private industry. They call this multinational corporations. And then there's a group called MEN, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, which is trying to deal with the income inequality and the exploitation of the natural resources. All right, and then I just threw a couple of random facts in here. We already mentioned about the military coups. Just like China and Mexico, which have very strong systems of, who you know gets you jobs in the government. If you give political and economic favors to people, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. In Nigeria, that is called prebendalism. So those three countries probably have the highest level of what they call this patron-client relationship. Civil society does exist, though, in Nigeria. The government has tried to, crush it earlier, but there really is a strong sense of civil society and groups committed to trying to improve the life there. We already mentioned the primary cleavage. Corporations that are run by the state are called parastatals, and they do exist in Nigeria as well. And most Nigerians get their news from the radio. Obviously, the wealthy people in the cities, they use television. And then our big topic for Nigeria would be the presence of Boko Haram. This is a terrorist group that the name translates into Western education is sinful. They've carried out many attacks, killing hundreds and hundreds of people. And the most infamous one is when they kidnapped girls at a boarding school in Chibok in 2014. That gained international attention. And there are, as we learned from our guest speaker, the government's faced a lot of scrutiny for whether or not it's doing enough and wants to do enough to deal with the terrorist actions of Boko Haram. So that is my notes for Nigeria, and thank you for listening to everything, and I wish you all the best of luck on the exam.